The day I signed the papers for my new house, I felt like I had finally escaped a chapter of my life that had dragged on for too long. The property sat on the edge of a quiet suburban neighborhood. It wasn't extravagant, but it had everything I wanted: a large backyard, mature trees, a detached workshop, and enough distance from the surrounding homes to provide a sense of privacy. Most importantly, there was no homeowners association attached to the property. That last detail wasn't accidental. After years of renting and listening to horror stories from friends who dealt with overbearing HOAs, I had specifically searched for a home free from neighborhood committees, endless regulations, and self-appointed enforcers who seemed to treat lawn height like a matter of national security. My realtor had actually emphasized the point several times during the purchase process. The neighborhood next to the property belonged to a large HOA. My house did not. A strange boundary line cut through the area decades earlier. Most homes on the main streets fell under the association's authority. My property and 3 others sat just outside those boundaries. At the time, the distinction seemed insignificant. I would soon discover it was the most important detail about the entire purchase. Moving day arrived on a warm Saturday morning. The neighborhood appeared peaceful. Families walked dogs. Children rode bicycles. Retirees worked in flower beds. Everything looked exactly like the kind of place where people minded their own business and respected each other's property. That illusion lasted less than 3 hours. The moving truck had barely finished unloading when I noticed a woman standing across the street. She wasn't walking, she wasn't gardening, she wasn't talking with neighbors. She was simply watching. At first I assumed she was curious about the new resident. That seemed normal. New people moving into a neighborhood naturally attracted attention. But as the afternoon progressed, she remained there, watching, evaluating, observing every box that came inside, every piece of furniture, every movement. By evening, I had the distinct feeling that I was being inspected. The following morning confirmed my suspicion. I stepped outside to begin unpacking equipment for my workshop and found a folded packet of papers resting against my front door. There was no envelope, no greeting card, no welcome message, just paperwork. The top page read, "Neighborhood Standards and Community Guidelines." Below it sat nearly 20 pages of regulations. Approved paint colors, approved mailbox designs, approved landscaping requirements, approved holiday decoration schedules, approved garbage can placement procedures, approved vehicle parking regulations. The list seemed endless. I initially thought someone had delivered the packet by mistake. Then I noticed a handwritten note attached to the front. It welcomed me to the neighborhood and informed me that compliance inspections occurred regularly. The note also stated that violations could result in fines. That was my first introduction to Karen. I didn't know her name yet, but I would soon learn it. A few hours later, while assembling shelving inside my garage, I noticed movement in the driveway. The same woman from the previous day had arrived. She stood near the entrance with the posture of someone conducting official business, the kind of posture that suggested authority, even when none existed. She appeared to be in her late 50s, perfectly styled hair, immaculate clothing, sunglasses despite standing in the shade. The overall appearance projected one message: control. She spent several minutes looking around my property, examining everything. The workshop, the trailer parked beside it, the stacks of lumber waiting to be organized, the partially unpacked moving boxes. The inspection seemed thorough enough to qualify as a formal audit. Eventually she left. I assumed that would be the end of it. I was wrong. The next morning, another note appeared. This one referenced the trailer. According to the note, trailers could not remain visible from the street for extended periods. The writer suggested immediate relocation. I laughed. The trailer sat entirely on my property. I had owned it for years, and nobody possessed authority over where I parked it. The note went into the recycling bin. 2 days later, another appeared. This time the concern involved lumber stacked beside the workshop. Apparently, Construction materials violated community appearance standards. That note joined the first one. A pattern quickly emerged. Every few days, another complaint surfaced. The workshop required repainting. The fence needed updating. The grass should be cut shorter. The mailbox didn't match community specifications. The exterior lighting failed to meet neighborhood standards. The complaints arrived with remarkable consistency. Meanwhile, I continued unpacking and settling into my new home. Then came the first direct confrontation. One evening after work, I returned to find the woman standing near the edge of my driveway. She wasn't simply passing by, she was waiting. The moment I parked, her attention locked onto me. What followed felt less like a neighborhood greeting and more like a property inspection. Her expression carried the confidence of someone accustomed to issuing instruction. She gestured toward various parts of my property while conducting what appeared to be a mental checklist. The trailer, the workshop, the fence, the landscaping, every feature seemed to receive scrutiny. Only then did she formally identify herself. Karen served on the HOA board, not just a member, a board member. The distinction clearly mattered to her. The introduction explained everything. Suddenly the endless notes made sense. The inspections, the observations, the constant monitoring. Karen wasn't merely a curious neighbor. She considered herself the guardian of neighborhood standards. The problem was that she had made one critical assumption. She believed my house belonged to her HOA. I politely informed her that the property sat outside the association boundaries. For a brief moment, confusion crossed her face. Then confidence returned. Apparently, she believed I was mistaken. That possibility amused me. After all, I had signed the paperwork. I had reviewed the surveys. I had confirmed the status repeatedly before purchasing the home. There was no uncertainty whatsoever. Yet Karen seemed convinced that she understood my property better than I did. She departed with the unmistakable attitude of someone planning further investigation. Over the next week, the situation escalated. The notes became increasingly formal. References to violations appeared more frequently. Warnings hinted at consequences. One document even included language resembling an official citation. The paperwork looked impressive. Official letterheads, committee references, rule numbers, compliance deadlines. Anyone unfamiliar with the situation might have felt intimidated. I simply filed everything in a drawer. Then came an unexpected development. Neighbors started introducing themselves. Unlike Karen, they were friendly. Several quietly apologized for her behavior. Apparently, she had developed a reputation over the years. Residents described countless incidents involving complaints, inspections, and attempts to control minor details. Fence colors, garden decorations, holiday lights, parking habits, mailbox styles. Karen monitored everything. Many homeowners complied, simply because arguing required more energy than surrendering. One neighbor shared an especially important piece of information. Karen had been furious when my property sold. For years, she had wanted the parcel incorporated into the HOA. The previous owner had refused. Now a new owner had arrived. Apparently, Karen viewed the transition as an opportunity. That revelation transformed the entire situation. This wasn't about neighborhood standards. It wasn't about appearance. It wasn't about community harmony. Karen wanted control, and she believed persistence would eventually achieve it. Unfortunately for her, persistence worked both ways. A week later, I received something entirely different. Not a note, not a warning. An official-looking letter. The document claimed multiple violations had been observed on my property. It outlined fines, deadlines, compliance requirements, potential legal action. The package resembled something generated by an actual governing authority, except for one problem. The HOA possessed no authority over my house. None. Zero. The letter crossed a line. Until then, the situation had merely been annoying. Now it felt deliberate. Someone was attempting to create the impression of legal power where no legal power existed. That evening I gathered every document Karen had delivered since moving in. The stack had become surprisingly thick. As I reviewed the papers, A clear pattern emerged. Each notice grew more aggressive than the previous one. Each demand became more specific, and every letter relied on the assumption that I would eventually surrender. Instead, I became curious, very curious. I decided it was time to learn exactly how far Karen intended to push this fantasy. The next morning, I made several phone calls. I contacted the county records office. I reviewed property maps. I requested copies of boundary documents. I verified everything I already knew. The results were crystal clear. My property sat entirely outside HOA jurisdiction. There were no gray areas, no disputed lines, no loopholes, no special conditions. Legally speaking, Karen's authority ended at the edge of the neighboring subdivision. What I didn't know was that Karen had already begun taking things much further than notes and letters. While I was gathering documents, she was planning her next move. And that move would transform a mildly annoying neighbor dispute into a full-scale neighborhood spectacle. By the end of the following week, half the neighborhood would be talking about what happened. And Karen was about to discover that trying to control property you don't own can become a very expensive mistake. The moment I confirmed through county records that my property was completely outside the HOA's jurisdiction, I expected the situation to become simpler. I was wrong. What I didn't understand at the time was that Karen's behavior had never been based on facts. It had been based on assumptions. More specifically, assumptions that nobody would ever challenge her. For years, she had operated in an environment where most residents eventually complied. Some homeowners fought back briefly, but few had the time or patience to engage in prolonged disputes. Karen understood this dynamic well. Persistence was her greatest weapon. She counted on exhaustion. She counted on frustration. Most importantly, she counted on people deciding that peace was worth more than principle. Unfortunately for her, I wasn't interested in surrendering property rights simply because someone disliked my workshop. The first sign of escalation appeared 3 days after I gathered the county documents. I arrived home from work and immediately noticed something attached to my front gate. A bright orange notice, the kind designed to attract attention. The document claimed my property was under review for multiple violations. It referenced fines, inspections, compliance deadlines, administrative penalties. At first glance, it looked official. Closer inspection revealed the truth. It was an HOA notice. An HOA notice attached to a property that wasn't even part of the HOA. The sheer absurdity would have been funny if Karen hadn't been taking it so seriously. I carefully removed the notice and added it to the growing file folder containing every document she had delivered. The collection was becoming impressive. What surprised me was Karen's confidence. At no point did she appear uncertain. At no point did she seem concerned that she might be mistaken. Instead, every action suggested complete certainty that she possessed authority over my property. That certainty would soon become her greatest weakness. Over the next several days, neighbors began sharing additional stories. The more people talked, the clearer the picture became. Karen wasn't simply active within the HOA. She practically treated it as her personal kingdom. Officially, she held only one vote on the board. Unofficially, she behaved as though she owned the neighborhood. Residents described years of conflicts, arguments over landscaping, arguments over paint colors, arguments over fence repairs, arguments over holiday decorations, arguments over nearly everything imaginable. Several homeowners admitted they had paid questionable fines simply because fighting seemed easier than continuing the battle. Others quietly complied with demands that weren't actually supported by HOA regulations. Karen's greatest skill wasn't understanding the rules. It was convincing people she understood them. That distinction mattered, because eventually someone would verify the facts, and facts tend to be dangerous for people who rely on assumptions. A week later, the conflict reached a new level. I discovered Karen walking around the perimeter of my property, not on the public sidewalk, not from across the street. She was actively inspecting boundary areas, taking photographs, making notes, studying structures, examining landscaping. The behavior felt less like a concerned neighbor and more like someone preparing evidence for a court case. The strange part was that she appeared completely comfortable doing it. almost entitled, as though my property represented unfinished business she intended to resolve. Meanwhile, I continued improving the house. The workshop received upgrades. The yard became more organized. Several landscaping projects began taking shape. The property looked better every week. Ironically, many neighbors complimented the improvements. Karen seemed to view those same improvements as violations. Then came the letter. Not another warning, not another notice. A certified letter. That caught my attention. Certified mail suggested someone wanted documentation. A paper trail, evidence of communication. Inside was what appeared to be a formal fine assessment. According to the letter, I supposedly owed hundreds of dollars for multiple violations. Additional penalties would accumulate if corrections weren't completed. Failure to comply could result in further action. I read the document twice, then a third time. The claims remained just as ridiculous with each reading. An HOA that had no authority over my property was attempting to collect money from me. The situation had crossed from annoying into bizarre. What made it even stranger was Karen's apparent expectation that I would actually pay, as if a homeowner would simply write a check because an unfamiliar organization demanded one. That evening, I made another round of phone calls. This time, I contacted individuals associated with the HOA itself. What I learned surprised me. Several board members appeared unaware of the extent of Karen's campaign. They knew she disliked my property. They knew she frequently discussed it during meetings. But many assumed the matter involved a legitimate jurisdiction issue. Few had investigated beyond her descriptions. That realization changed everything. For the first time, I began suspecting Karen wasn't merely overstepping. She might actually be misrepresenting facts to other board members. If true, that would explain her confidence. She had spent so much time repeating her version of reality that she may have started believing it herself. The following weekend provided confirmation. The HOA held a community meeting. Although my property wasn't part of the association, the gathering took place in a public facility. Several neighbors encouraged me to attend, not to participate, simply to observe. Curiosity won. I arrived quietly and sat near the back. The meeting progressed normally at first. Budget discussions, maintenance projects, community updates. Then my property appeared on the agenda. The moment it did, Karen transformed. She presented photographs, documents, lists of alleged violations, descriptions of supposed non-compliance. The presentation sounded dramatic. A listener unfamiliar with the facts might have assumed I represented a serious threat to neighborhood stability. Yet one crucial detail remained missing. Karen never mentioned that my property wasn't inside the HOA. Not once. That omission spoke volumes. As discussion continued, several board members began asking questions, reasonable questions, questions requiring specific answers, questions involving jurisdiction, boundaries, authority, legal responsibility. The atmosphere shifted, slowly at first, then noticeably. For the first time, Karen looked uncomfortable. The confidence that normally defined her demeanor began showing small cracks. People wanted documentation. People wanted proof. People wanted verification. The assumptions that had carried her this far suddenly seemed less convincing. The meeting ended without action. But something important had happened. Doubt had entered the room. And once doubt appears, certainty becomes difficult to maintain. The next few days were strangely quiet. No notes, no warnings, no letters. The silence felt unusual, almost suspicious. Then everything exploded. One afternoon, multiple vehicles appeared near the neighborhood entrance. Not police, not emergency services, surveyors, professional surveyors. Workers carrying equipment began examining property boundaries throughout the area. The sight immediately attracted attention. Neighbors gathered. Questions spread. Speculation followed. Nobody seemed entirely sure what was happening, except me. Because I had requested updated boundary verification, not because I needed it. The county records were already clear, but I wanted indisputable physical confirmation. Visible confirmation. Confirmation nobody could argue with. The survey process lasted several days. Markers appeared. Measurements were taken. Records were reviewed. By the end, the results matched every document I already possessed. My property stood completely outside HOA boundaries, not partially, not mostly, completely. The surveyor's findings left no room for interpretation. Word spread quickly. Neighbors discussed it constantly. Some appeared amused. Others seemed relieved. Many had grown tired of the ongoing drama. Karen, however, reacted differently. Rather than accepting reality, she appeared furious. The survey hadn't solved the problem from her perspective. It had exposed it. For months she had acted as though authority existed. Now visible evidence contradicted her narrative. Instead of retreating, she doubled down. That decision proved catastrophic. Within days, new notices appeared. New accusations surfaced. New complaints circulated. The escalation became impossible to ignore. Even residents who previously avoided involvement began questioning her behavior. People started comparing stories, comparing documents, comparing experiences. Patterns emerged. Uncomfortable patterns. Several homeowners realized they had received similar threats over unrelated issues. Others discovered regulations had been cited incorrectly. A few found fines that appeared unsupported by actual HOA rules. Karen's campaign against my property had unintentionally encouraged neighbors to examine her past actions. The results weren't flattering. Meanwhile, HOA leadership found itself facing difficult questions. Questions about oversight. Questions about enforcement procedures. Questions about authority. Questions about accountability. The attention Karen had sought for my property was now focusing directly on her, and she seemed completely unaware of the danger. She continued pushing forward, continued filing complaints, continued distributing notices, continued insisting she possessed power that documents clearly disproved. Every action dug the hole deeper. Every accusation created additional scrutiny. Every attempt at control generated more resistance. Then came the moment that changed everything. A special HOA board review was scheduled. Not to discuss my property, not to discuss violations, not to discuss compliance. The review would examine how enforcement actions had been handled, including Karen's actions, including her documentation, including her repeated claims regarding my house. The news spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. People who normally ignored HOA politics suddenly became interested. At terrace, expectations skyrocketed. Residents wanted answers. Board members wanted answers. And for the first time since I moved into the neighborhood, Karen would be required to support her claims with actual evidence. No assumptions, no intimidation, no unofficial authority, just facts. The problem was that facts had never been on her side. As the meeting date approached, tension spread across the community. Everyone sensed something significant was about to happen. Nobody knew exactly how dramatic it would become, but one thing was certain. Karen's campaign against my property had created consequences she never anticipated. And at the upcoming meeting, those consequences were finally going to catch up with her. The only question remaining was how spectacular the fallout would be. That answer would arrive sooner than anyone expected. By the time the special HOA review meeting arrived, the atmosphere throughout the neighborhood had completely changed. What had started as a dispute over one house had evolved into something much larger. Residents who normally ignored HOA meetings planned to attend. Neighbors who had spent years quietly complying with questionable demands suddenly wanted answers. Board members who previously trusted reports without verification were now reviewing documents more carefully. Most importantly, people were talking. They were talking in driveways, talking during evening walks, talking at community gatherings, talking about Karen. For years, many homeowners had simply accepted her behavior as an unavoidable part of neighborhood life. Now, for the first time, they were questioning it. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday evening. When I arrived, the parking lot was already packed. That alone said everything. Regular HOA meetings rarely attracted significant attention. This one felt different. This one felt important. Inside, nearly every seat was occupied. People lined the walls. Small groups gathered near entrances. Conversations filled the room. Everyone seemed to understand they were about to witness something unusual. Karen arrived carrying multiple folders. The sight immediately caught my attention. The folders were stuffed with papers, photographs, notes, and what appeared to be years of accumulated documentation. She looked confident, perhaps even overconfident. Her expression suggested she still believed this meeting would validate her actions. If she felt nervous, she hid it well. The board members appeared considerably less relaxed. Stacks of documents sat in front of them. Several legal references were visible. County property maps rested near the center of the table. The survey reports I had requested were also present. That detail alone told me the evening might not unfold the way Karen expected. Once the meeting officially began, the room quickly settled. The board president opened with a brief statement explaining the purpose of the review. The goal wasn't punishment. The goal was clarification. Questions had been raised. Documentation needed examination. Facts needed verification. A straightforward process, at least in theory. The first 20 minutes focused on property boundaries. County maps were displayed. Survey reports were reviewed. Historical records were discussed. Everything pointed toward the same conclusion. My property had never belonged to the HOA. Not recently. Not partially. Not technically. Never. The evidence was overwhelming. Professional surveys confirmed it. County records confirmed it. Property deeds confirmed it. The documentation wasn't complicated. In fact, it was remarkably simple. That simplicity created an uncomfortable problem. If the boundaries had always been clear, why had enforcement actions continued? The room became noticeably quieter. Attention shifted toward Karen. At first, she appeared prepared. She organized documents, reviews notes, examined paperwork. Then questions began. Questions regarding when she first learned about the property's status. Questions regarding notices. Questions regarding warnings. Questions regarding fines. Questions regarding representations made to other board members. Each answer seemed to create additional complications. The deeper the discussion went, the worse things became. Several board members revealed they had assumed Karen had verified the property's status years earlier. Others admitted they trusted her descriptions without independently checking records. Nobody expected such a basic fact to be incorrect. Why would they? Verifying jurisdiction seemed like the first step in any enforcement action, yet somehow that step had been skipped repeatedly. Then came the documents. Every notice, every warning, every letter, every violation report. The entire collection was reviewed one piece at a time. As the stack grew larger on the table, expressions throughout the room began changing. The volume alone surprised people. The timeline surprised them even more. The campaign against my property had continued for months, repeatedly, consistently, despite multiple opportunities to verify the truth. At one point, a board member asked a simple question: why continue issuing violations after learning the property sat outside HOA authority? The room became silent. The question hung in the air. Everyone waited. The answer never really came. Instead, explanations began shifting. Misunderstandings were mentioned. Confusion was mentioned. Administrative assumptions were mentioned. Unfortunately, the documentation told a different story. Each letter demonstrated increasing certainty. Each warning demonstrated increasing confidence. Each action showed deliberate escalation. The evidence didn't support confusion. It suggested persistence. And persistence became difficult to defend when directed towards someone outside HOA jurisdiction. As the review continued, something unexpected happened. Residents started sharing experiences. One homeowner described receiving repeated notices over landscaping that later proved compliant. Another recalled being threatened with penalties based on rules that didn't actually exist. Others described similar encounters. Individually, each story seemed minor. Together, they painted a troubling picture. A pattern emerged. Not necessarily corruption, not necessarily malicious intent, but certainly overreach. A belief that authority existed beyond its actual limits. Karen's dispute with my property had simply become the catalyst exposing it. The board members recognized this almost immediately. What began as an investigation into one situation was expanding into a broader examination of enforcement practices. The room's mood shifted dramatically. People weren't angry. They were disappointed. That disappointment proved far more damaging. Anger eventually fades. Disappointment lingers, particularly when trust is involved. As more information surfaced, Karen's composure began deteriorating. The confidence that defined her behavior for months slowly disappeared. Small signs appeared first. Frustration, impatience, visible irritation. Then those signs intensified. The more facts emerged, the more defensive she became. The more defensive she became, the more attention focused on her actions. It created a cycle she couldn't stop. For years, she had controlled conversations through certainty. Now certainty was gone. Only documentation remained, and documentation wasn't cooperating. The turning point arrived when one board member presented correspondence from county officials. The communication confirmed everything already established. Property boundaries were clear, jurisdiction was clear, authority was clear. There was no ambiguity, no alternate interpretation, no technical loophole. The matter was settled. At that moment, reality finally became unavoidable. Months of complaints, months of notices, months of threats, months of attempted enforcement, all directed toward a property completely beyond HOA control. A murmur spread through the room, not loud, not dramatic, just dozens of people simultaneously realizing the same thing. Karen had spent months fighting a battle she could never legally win, and she had dragged the entire HOA into it. The realization hit hard, especially because many neighbors had witnessed the conflict firsthand. Some had assumed Karen possessed authority. Others had remained uncertain. Now everyone knew the truth. The consequences arrived quickly. The board announced immediate changes to enforcement procedures. Verification requirements would be strengthened. Boundary reviews would become mandatory. Additional oversight would be implemented. Future violations would require multiple levels of approval. The reforms weren't aimed solely at Karen. They were designed to prevent similar situations from ever occurring again. Then came the final decision. Karen's enforcement responsibilities would be suspended pending further review. The announcement landed like a thunderclap. For years, she had positioned herself as the neighborhood's primary enforcer. Now that role was gone. At least temporarily. Perhaps permanently. The reaction throughout the room was remarkable. Nobody celebrated. Nobody applauded. Nobody mocked her. Instead, there was collective relief. Relief that the conflict was ending. Relief that facts had finally prevailed. Relief that common sense was returning. The meeting adjourned shortly afterward. Groups formed throughout the parking lot. People discussed what they had witnessed. Many seemed stunned by the scale of the situation. Others expressed regret for not questioning assumptions sooner. Several neighbors approached me afterward, not to gossip, not to criticize Karen, simply to acknowledge what had happened. The strange conflict that had dominated neighborhood conversation for months was finally over, or so everyone thought. The following morning provided one final twist. I stepped outside and noticed movement near the property line. Karen stood there, alone. No folders, no documents, no violation notices, no orange warnings. For the first time since I moved into the neighborhood, she simply looked like a neighbor. Nothing more, nothing less. She remained there briefly before walking away. No confrontation occurred. No dramatic scene unfolded. No final argument took place. The war had ended because reality had ended it. There was nothing left to fight. Over the following months, the neighborhood gradually returned to normal. The HOA implemented its reforms. Board oversight improved. Enforcement complaints decreased significantly. Residents became more engaged in meetings. Questions were asked more often. Verification became standard practice. The culture slowly changed. As for my property, life became wonderfully uneventful. The workshop remained exactly where it had always been. The trailer stayed parked on my land. The landscaping projects continued. The fence remained unchanged. No mysterious notices appeared. No warnings arrived. No fines materialized. Peace finally returned. Looking back, the most surprising part wasn't Karen's behavior. Every community eventually produces someone who mistakes influence for authority. The truly surprising part was how long nobody challenged the assumptions. One simple property boundary, one basic fact, one easily verified record. That was all it took to unravel months of conflict. Karen had spent years believing control came from confidence. What she learned instead was that authority comes from legitimacy. Without legitimacy, even the loudest voice eventually runs out of power. My house remained exactly what it had been from the day I purchased it. A quiet property sitting just beyond the HOA boundary. A line on a map. A few feet of distance. Nothing extraordinary. Yet that small boundary exposed a truth an entire neighborhood needed to remember. Rules only matter when they actually apply. And no amount of determination can change a property line recorded in county records. In the end, the workshop stood. The trailer stayed. The house remained mine. and Karen finally learned the one lesson she had spent months trying to avoid. You cannot control what was never yours to control. The end.